The rise of new frugality. How South Korea's young generation is redefining consumption. Young people in South Korea are learning a new kind of discipline, not the discipline of ambition, but the discipline of restraint. They track every expense, celebrate days without spending, and bring coffee from home not because it's trendy, but because the future feels increasingly unaffordable. What looks like a minimalist lifestyle is, for many, a quiet adjustment to an economy that no longer guarantees stability. For decades, youth culture across advanced capitalist societies has been closely associated with consumption. To be young was to desire visibly. New fashion trends signaled belonging. Cafes functioned as semi-public living rooms, gadgets doubled as identity markers, and social media became a stage for lifestyle performance. Consumption was not merely economic activity. It was cultural participation. To buy was to exist socially. Yet among South Korea's generation in their 20s and 30s, this narrative is unraveling with striking speed. Instead of showcasing abundance, many young people now document restraint. Zero spending days, home-packed lunches, second-hand purchases, subscription cancellations, and deliberate avoidance of unnecessary consumption. The aesthetic of youth is no longer excess, but calculation. The story of young Jisik, a 22-year-old college student who spends only 7,100 Korean won in a day by cooking at home, carrying her own coffee, and relying on public transportation, is no longer unusual. Nor is Kang Min-chin, who often spends nothing at all in a day, treating protein drinks as his only luxury. These are not extreme cases of asceticism. They are increasingly ordinary examples of how young people are navigating daily life under prolonged economic pressure. This phenomenon, often described as low consumption living or new frugality, is frequently framed as a lifestyle trend, sometimes even celebrated as a form of ethical minimalism. But such framing risks obscuring a more uncomfortable truth. For many young Koreans, frugality is not a choice made from abundance. It is a strategy for survival within structural insecurity. What appears as self-discipline on the surface is, at its core, an adaptation to shrinking horizons. In earlier decades, consumption carried an implicit promise. Spending was aspirational because it was tethered to expectations of future stability. A young person could spend freely in their 20s with the assumption that career progression, wage growth, and asset accumulation would follow. Debt was temporary, and consumption functioned as an investment in social capital. Today, that promise has weakened. Consumption is no longer aspirational. It is risky. Recent survey data illustrates the depth of this shift. According to a weekly BIS survey of over 600 South Koreans in their 20s and 30s, nearly 70% reported actively reducing unnecessary spending in the past 6 months. Crucially, the primary motivation was not environmental awareness, ethical consumerism, or social media influence, but economic pressure, rising prices, savings anxiety, and uncertainty about the future. This marks a fundamental cultural reversal. Frugality is no longer stigmatized as deprivation or personal failure. Instead, it has become normalized and even moralized as financial intelligence. To cut expenses is to be responsible. To spend freely is to be naive. Unlike earlier generations who internalized the belief that time would eventually compensate for present sacrifice, today's young adults are growing up in an environment where the future feels fragile rather than generous. In that context, consumption does not signal confidence, it signals vulnerability. South Korea offers a particularly stark illustration of generational economic strain. Housing prices in Seoul have risen at a pace that far outstrips wage growth, rendering homeownership unattainable for large segments of the young population. Even the Jeon system, once a uniquely Korean buffer against rental precarity, has become increasingly inaccessible. At the same time, labor markets have grown more competitive and more precarious. Stable, long-term employment is delayed, fragmented, or replaced with short-term contracts and platform-based work. For many, adulthood is characterized less by independence than by prolonged uncertainty. These conditions reshape everyday decision-making. Economists describe the resulting behavioral shift as a move from growth-oriented consumption to risk-averse consumption. Spending is no longer evaluated primarily in terms of enjoyment or self-expression, but in terms of long-term consequence. Every purchase carries opportunity cost. Money spent today is money unavailable for housing deposits, emergency savings, or future education. Underlying this shift is a deeper erosion of trust in collective safety nets. Many young Koreans no longer expect meaningful support from either the state or family structures. Public housing is limited, social mobility feels stalled, and intergenerational wealth transfer is uneven. In response, financial self-discipline replaces institutional security. Low-consumption living is often compared to minimalism, but the distinction matters. Minimalism, at least in its popular Western form, is typically framed as a philosophical choice, a pursuit of simplicity, clarity, and intentional living. It presumes the ability to choose less because one already has enough. For many young Koreans, frugality is not ideological, it is circumstantial. Practices such as bringing homemade meals, limiting social outings, delaying purchases, or celebrating zero-spending days are not primarily acts of self-expression. They are practical adaptations to constraint. In this sense, new frugality resembles survivalism more than lifestyle branding. What is striking is how rapidly this adaptation has become culturally acceptable. Habits once associated with financial hardship are now shared openly, even proudly, as symbols of discipline and foresight. The stigma has shifted. It is no longer shameful to spend little, but increasingly questionable to spend carelessly. Social media as mirror, not motor. The rise of hashtags such as #underconsumptioncore might suggest that social media is driving this trend. But survey data and ethnographic studies suggest the opposite. Digital platforms are not the origin of low-consumption living, they are its mirror. Rather than encouraging restraint, social media functions as a space of validation. It reassures users that their frugality is shared, rational, and socially intelligible. Unlike earlier social media cultures centered on luxury and excess, underconsumption content highlights repetition, repair, and restraint. Wearing the same clothes repeatedly or using items until they wear out is no longer hidden, it is displayed as competence. In this way, social media has shifted from amplifying aspiration to normalizing limitation. It transforms private coping strategies into collective narratives, class, gender, and the uneven burden of frugality. It is important to note that low-consumption living is not experienced uniformly. Class background continues to shape both the necessity and the meaning of frugality. For those with family assets or property, restraint may function as a temporary strategy. For those without, it becomes a long-term condition. Gender also plays a role. Young women often face additional pressure to maintain presentability while cutting costs, navigating contradictory expectations of professionalism, attractiveness, and modest spending. Frugality, in this context, requires not only discipline but emotional labor. Thus, while new frugality is often framed as empowering, it also reflects unequal capacities to absorb risk. The ability to choose less is itself unevenly distributed. A global pattern of constrained aspiration, South Korea's experience is not unique. Across the United States, Europe, and Japan, young adults are rethinking consumption norms that dominated the post-pandemic era of revenge spending. Rising living costs, depleted savings, and interest rate hikes have prompted widespread retrenchment. The expansion of second-hand markets, resale platforms, and low-buy challenges reflects a broader generational recalibration. Spending is no longer assumed to be virtuous. Instead, restraint is framed as rational, ethical, and emotionally stabilizing. Yet the global nature of this trend raises uncomfortable questions. If an entire generation internalizes restraint as common sense, What happens to economic models dependent on perpetual consumption growth? Consumption as quiet resistance. Low consumption living does not necessarily mean rejecting consumption altogether. Rather, it signals a shift toward selective spending, allocating resources only to what aligns with personal values. Many young people still spend on health, education, or meaningful experiences, while cutting back on fast fashion, impulse purchases, and status-driven goods. In this sense, consumption becomes a form of identity not through abundance, but through refusal. Some scholars interpret this as a quiet resistance against an economic system that equates happiness with constant buying. Choosing not to consume becomes a way to reclaim agency in a system that offers limited control elsewhere. However, resistance here is individual rather than collective, adaptive rather than transformative. The risk of normalizing scarcity. Despite its appeal, new frugality carries political risk. Celebrating restraint can inadvertently normalize systemic failure, shifting responsibility from institutions to individuals. If housing remains unaffordable and labor markets insecure, frugality becomes less a lifestyle and more a moral expectation imposed on the young. The danger lies in mistaking endurance for solution. Without structural reforms in housing, employment, and social protection, low consumption living risks becoming a permanent condition of constrained aspiration. In such a scenario, dignity is preserved through discipline, but possibility continues to shrink. Conclusion: frugality is not the end of desire. The embrace of low consumption living among South Korea's young generation is neither a fleeting trend nor a moral crusade. It is a rational response to prolonged uncertainty. Far from signaling apathy or withdrawal, it reflects acute awareness of economic reality. From signaling apathy or withdrawal, it reflects acute awareness of economic reality. This generation is not rejecting happiness, it is renegotiating it under constraint. By consuming less, young people are not opting out of society, but struggling to construct a livable future within it. New frugality, then, is not simply about spending less. It is about asking harder questions about fairness, sustainability, and what a dignified life should look like when growth no longer guarantees security.